That's great. Thank you very much for inviting me, because every time any of us from the Reading Sheffield team give a talk, we always learn a lot more about people's reading. And already with Stella putting out the advertisement, I've got a wonderful account of Gillian Johnson's reading yesterday. So thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you, Stella. This evening, I want to introduce you to the Sheffield children who sought out books on their own. The Sheffield men and women that we interviewed shared with us their reading experiences from throughout their lives, but it is perhaps these early memories of hunting down books on their own that most excited, comforted, and entertained them. And they recall those memories particularly sharply. And as you will hear, those memories are shaped by the geography of Sheffield and the kinds of community in which they grew up. And I dedicate this talk to a local hero, the unofficial recruiting officer for the children's section of the Central Library, the inexhaustible Judith. Some of our 65 interviewees wanted to be referred by their full name, but Judith prefers to remain just Judith. And here she is, born in 1947, and she grew up half a mile from Portland Works in Pomona Street, which probably most of you will know runs parallel to the lower stretches of Ecclesall Road. And after the war, Judith's mother enrolled her daughter at the Central Library and soon let her take that journey on her own, probably from the age of 8 or 9. But in 1947, the path between Pomona Street and the Central Library lay along Eyre Street. The moor and the buildings to the west had been reduced by the Blitz to piles of rubble, so a more direct route was unavailable. So delighted was Judith with the riches she found when she arrived in the children's section that she became something of a book evangelist. And she describes, I remember running up Eyre Street with Sheila Thompson so she could join the library. They gave you a little round ticket which you kept and slotted the book's name. And my mother played pop with me because she didn't know where we were. To many of our readers, the first encounter with books meant fascination with the whole apparatus of issuing books. What was this little round ticket? I find it difficult to imagine, and I've never been able to track an image down. Some played libraries at home with their friends, and I'm very glad to see in the audience Judith Warrender, because she described to us her hesitancy about becoming a book monitor at Firth Park Library in the 1950s. And she didn't want to put herself forward to become a book monitor. So what she did, she went home and she created her own little library. And she had a set of cards so she could lend her books to her special friend. Now, this is the Central Library to which Judith ran, as imagined by Lawrence Whiteley in 2009. It was a magnificent building, and its stock in the late 40s was still rich in spite of post-war austerity, thanks to the guardianship of the exceptional chief librarian, Joseph Lamb. The Blitz was to destroy a huge amount of book stock lodged in publishers' warehouses in London, but Lamb had the foresight to buy at the beginning of the war cut-price stock that publishers were dumping. So before the major destruction of publisher stocks, he had bought a vast amount of fiction at nominal prices, enough for all the new library centres in Sheffield and 40,000 books in reserve. So Judith found every kind of book she craved, and an environment which enabled her to develop her considerable intelligence. She had passed her 11 plus to go to High Stores Grammar, but as for so many across Britain, she was not allowed to go because the family could not afford the uniform. She describes the sense of peace and satisfaction she experienced in the Central. I spent a lot of time in that children's library. You could sit there with any book you liked, encyclopedias, because at home it was, you know, hustle and bustle. We didn't have much because we had no money and there was no television in those days. And I just used to go to the library for a bit of peace on my own. There was 4 of us, and my grandmother and father and mother all rattling around in one house. The library was Judith's sanctuary throughout the 40s and 30s because her home was too full. But for Florence, 10 years earlier in the mid-1930s, it was a haven because her home was too empty. Born in 1923, Florence was one of the earliest beneficiaries of the Graves bequest, finding the pictures on the top floor as stimulating as the books 2 stories beneath. And Florence herself became an artist. Here is one of her paintings. She describes her solo expeditions. I think I was a rather solitary child. Your parents are busy working, and I used on a Saturday morning, I used to have a little trot round the moor by myself, you see. And I used to go to Central Library, get my library books, go up to the gallery. I used to like to go up there to look at the pictures, and then I used to go down to the reading room. You could read all sorts of magazines down there. Now, though she had many school friends, Florence was alone on a Saturday. Her best friend lived in Pittsmore and could not join her. Many grammar school children wandered alone round the library shelves or through the Graves gallery, while their contemporaries at neighbourhood schools played out in groups. On Saturdays, these books and pictures offered such grammar school children companionship. And the Central Library also attracted pupils on weekday evenings after school. Most of the grammar schools, as you'll know, were on the west of the city, so those journeying from the north, east, south changed buses in the city centre and often took the opportunity between the buses to use the unique resources of Central. And of our 65 interviewees, 13 used the Central Library as children, and all but 2 of these were grammar school pupils. Judith used it because she lived relatively locally, but the only other non-grammar school user had a special sense of ownership. Ted was born in 1919, and from the age of 12, for 2 days a week, he attended the art school in Surrey Street, opposite the building site that was to become the Central Library. He told us, when I was at the art school, we used to go out in the afternoon to watch them building the new library. We used to watch the cranes, the big stones. Very interesting that was. I was with that library right from the beginning. Everything was beautiful and spacious. Art gallery upstairs, theatre underneath. Ted left school at 14 for an engineering apprenticeship, but when we interviewed him, his small flat was full of art books. And his holidays were to visit his daughter in London and explore the National Picture Galleries. Now, equally stirring for many of our readers were the cheap commercial libraries used by their parents, but rarely on their own behalf. The municipal libraries were their chief source of books, but many had their first experiences of libraries thanks to their mother's or father's taste for pulp fiction. The 1930s and 40s were the heyday of so-called twopenny libraries, where no subscription was needed, just a down payment of 2pence for each book. And such libraries were round the corner from most families across the city, and they came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Before Judith ran up Eyre Street in 1947 on her own book adventures, she accompanied her mother, not to the municipal, but to the local twopenny library only a few blocks away. The Red Circle Library, which you can see second from the left, was her mother's Mecca, the source of the necessary romance. And Judith's mother described it as a circulating library, and her daughter always hoped she might catch it revolving. Decorous and stationary, its modest dimensions eclipsed by the bulk of Brunswick Chapel, this small twopenny library advertised its services with a great strapline. There above the Red Circle logo was the slogan, "Reading your cheapest pleasure." This isn't true, of course, but it sounds good. And for only 2pence, you could borrow for a week a copy of the latest romance or an adventure story from the wild American West, not necessarily available at municipal libraries, despite Joseph Lamb's openness to popular fiction. We also have memories of P.G. Wodehouse and Just Williams stories being borrowed from these commercial libraries. And there were countless such libraries, some just a shelf in a newsagent's, but some belonging to a well-serviced chain. Val Hewson chair of Reading Sheffield, had discovered the novel library in the High Street, where Timpson's is now. This was very successful until it went bankrupt in 1936. But the Red Circle franchise survived until well after the Second World War, and the branch behind the moor was only one of 5 mentioned by Reading Sheffield interviewees. The others were on Snig Hill, Angel Street, Darnall, and Infirmary Road. If you hear of any others, do tell me. Though only one of our readers borrowed books from them as an adult, they exercised quite a hold on the imagination of the children, peering up from beneath the counter. Judith remembers, still fascinated, the lurid images in the window of the Red Circle Library behind the moor. She said musingly, "Funny what sticks in your mind. In the window, they used to have several books, and I can remember this one. And it had a paper cover on, and there was a skull, and there were pearls rolling down its face. I must have been a macabre child. And it was called Devil's Tears, and that stuck in my mind for 60-odd years." Now, it's interesting that in Judith's imagination, the grotesque face on the cover was remembered as a skull rather than a demonic old woman. It's one of the many examples of the way childhood experiences come to be reimagined as we carry them forward in adulthood. Most of the trips to Tupney libraries were made with Mum, but as children got older, they might go on behalf of their fathers. Winnie Lincoln, a responsible 8-year-old in the early 30s, made a weekly trip to the Red Circle in Infirmary Road to choose her father's westerns and horse racing books, or as she called them, his gambling books. She chose them for her dad, keeping his previous borrowing record in her head, and I'd be in trouble if I brought back what he'd already said. She remembers a small shop crammed with women and children. Now, the content of the library books that these children saw their parents borrowing did not seem to interest the book carriers. Judith didn't look at her mother's bodice rippers, and Winnie's tastes were strictly for non-fiction later on in life. What these children did catch from the avidity of their parents to find the next romance, Western or Just William, was the reading bug, an appetite for whatever genre took your fancy, and a sense that your individual reading tastes were worth a precious Saturday hour or a weekly twopence. Maureen, born in 1945, is still entranced by memories of the Saturday visits she made with her mother to the Snig Hill Red Circle. They popped in on their way back from town to Burngreave. When they got off the bus in the early 50s, they would see the queue snaking its way down Snig Hill. And when Maureen went in with her mother and they approached the counter much higher than the child, Maureen remembers the speed with which assistants whipped off the purple covers in which the books were wrapped before they left the library. And as the covers shot up into the air and onto the floor behind the counter, Maureen recalls not only the smell of sugar paper and the library logo on each one, but something else that made her anxious. The originally clean sheets of paper, a rarity in post-war Britain, were stained with tea, and borrowers had written all over them messages, memos, and shopping lists. The post-war child was shocked at the waste, but has never forgotten the thrill of those visits, the shower of purple sugar paper, and the speed and dexterity of the assistants as they lined up the books for reshelving in the crook of their arm. Maureen's mother never joined a municipal library, but Maureen became an habitual library user. The only record we have of a child actually reading books from a Tupney library was Norman's. There he is, I guess, about 2 or 3. The use he made of his father's Tupney library, called Abbott's at the bottom of the Derbyshire Lane, was prodigious. Norman Absett's father was a highly intelligent man, but not much of a reader. A man called Ronald Batty, who wrote an invaluable guide to setting up a Tupney library, advised proprietors to establish an ancillary business so that you could chat to your customers over the purchase of something like tea or newspapers and gently point them towards the latest work of popular fiction. Mr. Absetts combined his library, regularly stocked by W.H. Smith, with an ice cream parlour. Meanwhile, the infant Norman seems to have sat on the floor of the library whenever he could, and read his way indiscriminately through its contents. The book he treasures to this day and read at the age of 6 is Philip Gibbs' City of Refuge. Published in 1936, it is the grim tale of what happened to families after they fled Russia after the Communist Revolution and were dispersed across the world. He reflects that this was a grown-up book. It was grown up in all kinds of ways. There was sex in it. There was murder and killing in it. There was everything in it, most of which I didn't understand. But I read it and shared in the sadness of it all. Norman's private passion for reading later translated itself into work he was able to do for education in his native city. The Adsets Library at Sheffield Hallam is named after him. Not every one of our readers was able to endow a library, but the vast majority shared his early experience of indiscriminate reading, reading whatever came to hand without parental guidance. And most readers lacked such guidance because many parents thought it not worth guiding their children's reading tastes. Maybe they didn't read themselves, but they also had the sense that reading wasn't necessarily going to help them find a living. 50 years earlier, in the late 1880s, the teenage Harry Brearley, where's Harry Brearley gone? Here he is, who many of you will know well. He was contemplating his future, absorbed by the subject of economics, the subject Norman Adsets was to study at university. This boy with little formal education longed to own his own copy of Ruskin's essay on economic questions unto this last. And in his memoir, he writes, "I was so much attracted by some of Ruskin's books that I neglected everything else to read them, and to read some of the less intelligible Carlyle. Ruskin's Unto This Last was a revelation. It was a library copy I read. I dare not steal it, and could not afford to buy it, so I copied it out in my most careful handwriting, and bound it in cloth boards with leather backs and corners. I've got quite a lot of copies of such homemade volumes here, and it's always a testimony to how precious those books were." So Harry Brearley created his own opportunity to reread, an opportunity so important to the making of a confident reader, and an opportunity denied to most of our readers in their childhood because of the lack of books in the home. Despite his passion for reading and his resourcefulness, Harry concluded regretfully that there was no living in books to be had in Sheffield, and indeed there was not at that time. Now, of course, it was Sheffield's great good fortune that Brearley did turn his back on Ruskin. Many of our readers recall a parent making a disparaging remark about the value of reading. "Put something in their hands," instructed the father of a little girl curled round a book. And that may indeed have been sound advice in Sheffield between the wars. It was a city with a less diverse range of types of employment than Birmingham, Leeds, or Manchester, for example. City hall jobs, of course, increased with the extension of local government powers in the 30s, and a significant number of the girls whose reading was encouraged were the daughters of men in such clerkly jobs. Attitudes changed significantly after the Second World War. Norman Adsets made his living in the 50s, not from literature directly, but certainly from his command of the word. His first jobs were in marketing and sales. But there was one glorious consequence of the dim employment prospects for a Sheffield child absorbed by the written page. Reading mattered so little that our readers were culturally unpoliced. "I just read whatever I could get hands on," is repeated time and time again. Most, like Norman, grew up simply reading what they could find. Sometimes their only guide was the alphabet. Shirley, as a teenager, was in the Central Library looking for the thrilling adventures by Baroness Orksey. I don't know if any of you read The Scarlet Pimpernel, and they are indeed cracking adventure stories. Then she came across in the shelf devoted to O, the deliciously long run by a person with the mysterious name Ouida. These sensationalist novels, her first in 1863 was called Held in Bondage, were shocking in their day. And the mocking cartoon from Punch, which I don't know if you can read, but at the bottom it says, "Oh, fie, 'tis an unreaded garden," about a dissolute woman reading a copy of Wyre. Shirley gave them a go and concluded not so much that they were shocking or full of literary weeds, but that they were dreadfully old-fashioned. But she discovered them and read them before being weaned off them. This openness and lack of embarrassment about whatever one is reading is utterly characteristic of our readers, the vast majority of them. And when we were interviewing our readers, it was particularly exciting to be shown a diary of the books that they had read. Malcolm Mercer shared with us a precious notebook he had kept meticulously of everything, all the books he had read in the years after he left school at 14. Now, Malcolm didn't pass the 11 plus, and like so many able children in the 30s and onwards, he was not able to go to grammar school and get qualifications. However, he went on to gain an MA, became the headmaster of Parson Cross School, and to write a superb history of the elementary education in Sheffield. And he did this by devising a personal curriculum, evidence of which he showed us in a precious pocketbook recording his reading between the years 1940 and 42, aged 15 to 17. He was working in a shop in the day, while many of his friends from the scouting movement or from church were preparing for their school certificate exam. We have seen a number of such personal reading diaries, and each one is a precious testament to the fact that reading had become, in the minds of these diarists, a way of marking their self-development and the value of their personal tastes. In his first years of employment, Malcolm was determined to educate himself despite working long hours and with no apparent hope of academic qualification. So as you can see, he read Edwardian fiction, he likes John Buchan, he read practical self-help books, and he read the classics, such as The Meditation of Antonius Marcus Aurelius, very demanding, and the fairy stories of Hans Christian Andersen, less so. But the list of authors beginning with B is a poignant testimony to his keen sense of the opportunities he'd lost by failing the 11 plus. The titles of the books on B page hammer home his determination not to fail again. First class, success, and succeed he did. Mavis, like Malcolm, grew up in a family which valued education. However, she was fortunate in being born 12 years later in 1937, so there were far more grammar school places than were available in Malcolm's day. She got the top mark in her year and gained a place at the Sheffield High School for Girls, travelling over from Tinsley to Broom Hill. Here she is. She was guided, obviously, at grammar school in her school subjects, but out of school she went freelance, and she was let loose in the adult section of the Central Library. She adopted the alphabet method that had led her contemporary Shirley to the shocking melodramas of Wyre. Mavis started with the W's. I found Hugh Walpole, Leo Walmsley, and I think accidentally someone had filed Warwick Deeping in the W's, and I read him, and I just read others by those authors. But as is characteristic of our readers, she had no shame at reading these popular novelists, despite being at a school which was teaching her the classics. She says it would be George Eliot one week and The Island of Adventure the next, or The Adventures of Scamp. I had a horse phase like all little girls, but I was reading quite a lot of adult fiction at the same time, especially as the stuff that I got led onto was always available. You didn't get a big queue for the next George Eliot, whereas you did for the Enid Blytons. Now, this diet served Mavis well until she found herself on the train to Leeds in 1955 to see if she was fit to be a literature student there. Her indiscriminate and unpoliced reading nearly cost her the chance of a university place. The 17-year-old was anxious about the journey to Leeds. Would she miss her stop and end up in Scotland? So she seized her mother's copy of the Reader's Digest magazine, knowing she wouldn't get lost in it and miss her stop. What she hadn't anticipated was her interviewer's first question. "So, Miss Garrett, what did you read on the train?" So I said, "Reader's Digest." And I saw his expression and I thought, ah. She instantly saw where it was going, and she explained she would have been far too absorbed in a George Eliot or Thomas Hardy novel to risk reading it on a new and unfamiliar train journey. She was a clever girl. But she would not have been so nearly trapped had she grown up in a culture where there was any shame to reading Reader's Digest or Enid Blyton. Mavis became a teacher, as did most of the scholarship girls born in the 30s, another avenue that opened out for bookish girls in the 1940s and 50s. But whatever she taught, she always encouraged her pupils to read whatever they wanted, always making sure they were also guided to books that would develop their tastes. Now, there is far more that can be said about the Sheffield men and women's childhood journeys, but I'd like you at this point to direct you towards our website. Alongside the ongoing research, you will find at the heart of the website the individual stories of the 65 readers we interviewed in our initial research project. All these readers were born between 1919 and 1945. As Stella has said, we were formed in 2012, and we were only able to do what we did because of money granted us by the Sheffield Town Trust and by Sheffield Hallam Universities. And we had 12 interviewers, and we were trained by Claire Jenkins, a local journalist, and a colleague, and we shaped our interviews by a list of prompts. And these prompts were simply that. They were not a checklist. And what we did is, when we discovered a passion or an interesting avenue we might lead our reader to explore, we abandoned some of the prompts and went where the reader led us. So, for example, we discovered that Mary Saw had kept in the late 1930s a confessions book in which she'd collected the reading and musical taste of her dancing companions when she was about 15, 16. And when we discovered this wonderful book that her daughter Frances has made available to us, we abandoned various questions and we explored this wonderful record of teenage culture in 1930s Nether Edge. So you won't find that our survey was a scientific one or necessarily a reliably representative sample of Sheffield's readers across the city. But we did try as much as we could to gather readers from across the city, from different areas, using different libraries. And this might help you appreciate the sort of range of occupations from which our readers' fathers came. 25 of our 65 were children of manual workers, 6 of retail, 13 of managers or professional. 7 were the children of clerical workers and travelling salesmen. And in a way, I think those children often benefited because their parents could see that there was a living in command of the written word. 6, we were not given the occupation of the father, or the father had been absent. And 4 were from a wealthy manufacturing class. 2 were children of musicians, and 1 the child of a policeman. These are the libraries used by our interviewees, and as you can see, there is central with the majority of the readers, and that is so much to do with the pattern of grammar schools and the pattern of the bus service. You may wonder why the next most popular is Hillsborough with 6, and that reflects our slightly idiosyncratic way of recruiting, because I was invited to go to an exercise group in Wadsley called Slightly Sprightly. And this was absolutely fascinating because the women in this group seemed to be all readers, and they wanted to talk about their readers, their reading. And 3 of them gave me a group interview from which I learned a huge amount about their reading and about progressive elementary education in Wisewood in the 30s. So the different groups that we visited, the different library events we've gone to, have always resulted in learning things we just did not anticipate learning. And in this context, I really would like to say a very big thank you to Gillian, who has, Gillian Johnson, who's here tonight, who responded to Stella's request that you send me your reading journeys if possible. And I was delighted to get this, Gillian, partly because I'm very interested in one of the libraries that I haven't mentioned so far, which was the Boots circulating library, which you may or may not have heard of. Many of our readers hadn't heard of it, even though they went to school next door, because it was on Fargate, above Boots the chemist. And of course, it was much more expensive than the Twopenny libraries, and in some people's minds, much more prestigious. There was an awful fear about borrowing books from the municipal library in some people's minds because they thought they might transmit germs. But there was this assumption that Boots somehow was germ-free. And one of our readers said, if I could have afforded it, I would have joined Boots, and couldn't. We do have one girl who did sort of use Boots, and her mother worked in Cole Brothers just over the road. And when her mother was working on in Coles on the Saturday, she would pop over to Boots and she would infiltrate herself amongst the shelves of the Boots library and read the books straight off the shelves. And I don't know whether or not the librarian was aware of this, but it was Mavis, in fact, gave Mavis a great deal of pleasure. But Gillian shared with me in her email yesterday that her mother too, and I think I'm right, Gillian, please correct me afterwards, that your mother worked in Portland Works as a buffer girl, and she joined Boots in order to be able to borrow romance novels. And she also joined the Red Circle Library, so she was obviously a very enterprising library user. And Gillian herself became chief librarian of Doncaster. So, as I've said, the sort of all these libraries fostered the reading bug. And there's a lovely image that Gillian describes of going with her father up to Manor. And I found a picture for you, Gillian, of the Manor Library at the time when I think you would have been using it. Because Gillian describes her father taking her from the Park Library, which in the 50s was a bit dismal, up onto the top where the lovely new Manor Library had opened, this Art Deco columns and masses of shining glass. And the children's library was behind a glass partition. And Gillian would just sit there reading until her father knocked on the glass. And it was obviously one of the sort of prides of the Sheffield Library Service, the Manor, and its opening delayed. I'd like to point you at the end now to the research of the chair of Reading Sheffield, Val Hewson, which is extensive and on the culture of the municipal libraries in the 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. And I think Val probably knows more about the chief librarian, Joseph Lamb, than anyone in the country. And her research on municipal libraries, and Lamb in particular, can be found on our website. So she is in the audience, so if you want to direct any questions to her, please do so. But I would love to hear any questions from you now and about our project. And over to you. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you.